Needless to say, I'm late. Because it's never too late to talk about such festivals. I mean the Russian Automobile Festival St. Petersburg Transport Fest, which took place at the end of May in St. Petersburg. I visited this festival for the third time, and I am ready to admit with pleasure that every year it turns out to be more and more bright and grandiose. By now it has become a real event in the life of all connoisseurs of both historical and modern automotive technology. One of the reasons why it is visited by many citizens and guests of the city is a well-chosen format that combines the demonstration of legendary cars from different times, carefully restored historical trucks and buses, cars of the Second World War era, modern models of urban public transport, as well as samples of the newest, often still being prepared for the production of buses, trolleybuses, electric buses and trams. However, I will talk about modern technology in one of the following videos, and in this video we will talk about the most interesting historical cars, trucks and buses shown at the festival. For example, the American Dodge of the era of the Second World War, but not ordinary, but in a 3-axle version, is an obvious attempt with little effort to achieve both an increase in carrying capacity and an increase in cross-country ability. It is difficult to judge the cross-country ability, but the carrying capacity of such a modification really managed to be raised to 1.5 tons. This is how the Americans turned out to be a light cargo all-terrain vehicle. And here is the exposition of the Willys, one of the most striking symbols of the mechanization of the warring armies during the Second World War. Unpretentious, passable and, at the same time, an inexpensive car that fought on all fronts. One of the symbols of Lend-Lease. This Willys then, in the 1950s, almost began to be produced in the Soviet Union as in the Moskvich 415. But then the Russian military adopted another car, the GOZ-69, as a light command SUV, which went into production in 1952 at the Gorky automobile plant, and then was transferred to the Ulyanovsk automobile plant. Without a doubt, the GOZ-69 is one of the few unconditional successes of the Soviet automotive industry throughout its existence, one of the best SUVs in the world in their entire history. Here on the left is, to some extent, the forerunner of the current light Russian off-road truck Sadko. This is the GOZ-63 produced since 1946, an off-road vehicle using components and assemblies of the famous GOZ-51 truck, from which it differed in an all-wheel drive transmission. True, such a transmission did not increase the patency of the GOZ-63 too much. Its successor, the GOZ-66, which received self-locking differentials in the drive axles, became truly highly traversable. One of the most famous Soviet off-road trucks, ZIL-157. Simple, cheap and very passable. It was produced for an incredibly long time, from the late 1950s to the early 1990s, first at the Likhachev plant, and then at the Ural Automotive plant in the city of Novorossk. In the 1960s, it was the ZIL-157 that was the basis of the Soviet Army's fleet. The successor to the ZIL-157, the more advanced and comfortable ZIL-131. He came to the festival in a fire variant, but this variant looks a bit unusual. But one of the most unusual trucks in Eastern Europe, the Czech Prado V3S, has a completely authentic body, exactly the same with which this car was produced in the 1970s and 1980s. A small part of these trucks ended up in the Soviet Union. Here is another representative of the Czechoslovak automobile industry of that time. Skoda Liaz 706MT. This is the third generation of Skoda trucks, launched in 1966. This particular example, which became the basis for the car lift, was made in 1985, just 3 years before this model was taken off the assembly line. But the car going to the festival is not even mass, but supermass. The Soviet GOZ-53 with a tank of beer and a trailer with this. It is followed by a unique specimen, a mobile television center, which was built on the chassis of a KAMAZ truck in the 1980s by the Finnish company Aoki. And this is a ZIL 4421 truck tractor from the 1990s with a strange, obviously not serial radiator lining. Behind him is the horror and curse of all Soviet drivers of the 1970s, 1980s, the KAZ-608V Kolchis tractor. Here is the cabin of this tractor, the height of utility and minimalism. By the way, surprisingly, the cabin at Kolchis turned out to be triple. The Soviet KAMAZ 5320, like the Kolchis, is also a sample of the second half of the 1970s, but this truck is of a completely different technical level. More recently, the most massive heavy truck in Russia somehow imperceptibly passed into the category of rare trucks. Further, the Czech Tatra 815 drove to the festival venue with its classic clubfoot rear suspension and not at all classic tires. This dump truck is well known to the participants in the shot construction of communism in the 1980s. And then some strange hybrid of an off-road KRAZ truck and a KRAZ dump truck drove by, moreover, with a serial body, which was really put on such dump trucks. But in this form, KRAZ trucks have never been mass-produced. The trolleybus played a very important role in the public transport of the Soviet Union and was widely distributed. The most interesting thing is that virtually all the most common trolleybuses in the Soviet Union were shown at St. Petersburg Transport Fest, from the very first to the most recently launched routes and carrying passengers. Here, in the center and on the right, two pre-war trolleybuses produced in the city of Yaroslavl are visible, and on the left, the post-war MTB-82D, produced from 1946 to 1961. But these are more modern cars. The farthest one is the ZU-5, then comes the ZU-682, which was also called the ZU-9. It was put into production in 1972. It became the most massive trolleybus in the world. To the right of the ZU-9 is the Czechoslovak Skoda 90R, prepared for restoration, imported to the Soviet Union throughout the 1970s. Interestingly, the largest Soviet republic, the Russian Federation, did not receive a single such Skoda, but other republics received them, and most of all, Ukraine. The largest number of such Skoda was in Kiev and in the Crimea. This particular Skoda is awaiting restoration, so it is very possible that in 1 or 2 years we will already see it in finished form. The ZU-5 trolleybus went into production at the Uritsky plant just 2 years earlier than the Skoda 90R, in 1959, and it was produced until 1972. For its time, it was an excellent trolleybus, however, with strange-sized seats, on which it was too loose to sit alone, and too crowded together. Compared to the most massive Soviet bus, the low-powered Liaz 677, this trolleybus picked up speed like a jet aircraft and, unlike the Liaz bus, which was barely traveling during peak hours, it didn't matter if there were a lot of people in the cabin or few. For its time, it was the best urban transport in the Soviet Union. That's all. We look forward to next May and the next St. Petersburg Transport Fest, which I hope will take place in St. Petersburg in 2023.